On a Tuesday morning in April of 2019, Harlan Dykstra stood at the edge of his field in Tama County, Iowa, and watched $47,000 worth of planting season disappear into a software error he couldn't read, couldn't fix, and couldn't explain to the bank that was already watching his numbers. The message on the monitor had appeared at 6:14 in the morning. It was 3 lines of code and a blinking cursor. His John Deere 177 ONTCCS planter, a machine that had cost him $312,000 new in 2016, a machine with GPS row shutoffs and variable rate seeding, and a touchscreen that could adjust population rates from the cab, had simply stopped talking to itself. The hydraulic downforce system had locked. The row units had gone into a fault state. The monitor showed an error code that wasn't in the manual Harlan had, because the manual Harlan had was for the previous software version, and sometime in the night, through the cellular connection he'd never asked for and didn't fully understand, the machine had downloaded a firmware update from a server in Moline, Illinois, and woken up speaking a language its own sensors no longer recognized. Harlan was 44 years old. He'd farmed 1,800 acres in Tama County for 22 years, first with his father, and then alone after his father's stroke in 2009. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had survived the 2012 drought, a $180,000 equipment loan at 7.2% interest, and 3 consecutive years in which corn prices fell faster than his input costs. He was methodical and careful, and he kept his records in a green spiral notebook that he replaced every January. He was not a man who panicked easily. But standing in that field on that Tuesday morning, watching the cursor blink on a screen that had cost more than his first truck, his first tractor, and his first combine combined, Harlan Dykstra felt something very close to panic. He called the dealership in Marshalltown at 6:30. The service line opened at 7. He called again at 7:02 and reached a technician named Brandon, who told him they were aware of the issue, that several customers had reported the same error code, and that a patch was being developed by the engineering team. When Harlan asked how long, Brandon said he wasn't sure. When Harlan asked if they could roll back the update, Brandon said he didn't think that was possible remotely, and that a service technician would need to come out. When Harlan asked when that technician could come, Brandon checked the schedule and said Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. The 10-day forecast showed a closing window. Harlan had a field that needed to be in the ground by Friday at the latest if he wanted to hit his optimal planting date for his corn hybrid, a hybrid he'd paid a premium for specifically because of its early season cold tolerance. Every day past optimal planting date cost him, on average, a half bushel per acre per day. He had 620 acres of corn planned. Do the math. Let me tell you about what happened in the next 36 hours, because it matters to understanding what came after. Harlan's neighbor to the east, a man named Curtis Webb, who farmed 2,400 acres with a newer ExactEmerge planter, had the same error on his monitor by 7:15 Tuesday morning. Curtis had paid $487,000 for his machine. He had the extended service contract, the Precision Ag package, the remote diagnostic subscription. His error code was different from Harlan's by 1 digit, which meant it was a different fault in the same update, which meant the patch that fixed Harlan's machine might not fix Curtis's. Curtis got a service technician out by Wednesday morning because he had a priority service contract. The technician spent 4 hours on the machine and left without fixing it. He said the patch wasn't ready yet. A man named Dennis Sorensen, who farmed the river ground 3 miles south, had a Kinsey 3600 with a seed sense monitor system. His planter used a different controller, a different software architecture, a different update pathway. His machine worked fine. Dennis planted 300 acres on Tuesday and 280 on Wednesday, while Harlan and Curtis and at least 11 other farmers in Tama County sat in their yards and waited for a patch from Moline, Illinois. By Wednesday afternoon, the county extension office had received calls from 9 separate farmers. The Marshalltown dealership had 4 service trucks in the field and a waiting list of 14. A regional John Deere rep named Jason Crowley drove up from Des Moines on Wednesday morning and spent the day on the phone with the engineering team, relaying information back to the service technicians in a process that everyone agreed was not working as fast as anyone needed it to work. Crowley was 38 years old, had a degree in agricultural business from Iowa State, had been with the company for 12 years, and he was very good at his job. He understood the technology. He understood the business. He understood that every hour of delay was costing his customers money and costing his dealership relationships that had taken years to build. He was working as hard as he knew how to work. The patch arrived Thursday morning at 4:47 a.m. It pushed automatically to all affected machines through the cellular connection. By 6 a.m., the monitors were showing clean screens. By 7 a.m., Harlan Dykstra was in his cab, running his planter through a test pass at the field edge, watching the row units cycle and the downforce numbers settle and the population readout climb to the target rate. He planted 620 acres in the next 4 days. He hit his window. Barely. But here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. Harlan Dykstra got lucky. The window held, the patch worked, the yield loss was probably there. He'd estimate later, looking at his harvest data, that he'd lost somewhere between 8 and 12 bushels per acre on the ground he'd planted Thursday and Friday. The ground that went in 2 days late, on 620 acres at $3.80 corn, that was somewhere between $18,000 and $28,000 in yield he'd never recover. And that was the good outcome. That was the outcome where the patch came in time. Curtis Webb lost his window entirely on 400 acres of his best ground. His technician got the machine running Friday afternoon. The forecast closed Saturday. He planted into suboptimal conditions and spent the rest of the summer watching those fields underperform. His estimate at the end of the season was $61,000. Now, let me tell you about Emmett Johansson, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. And what he did is the reason this story is still being told in Tama County today. Emmett Johansson was 71 years old in the spring of 2019. He farmed 280 acres on the north side of the county, the same 280 acres his father had farmed and his grandfather before that. Ground that had been in the Johansson family since 1924. He was a tall man, thin in the way that men who have worked outdoors their whole lives get thin, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than wood, and a way of standing still that made you think he was thinking about something important. He wore the same thing almost every day: canvas work pants, a flannel shirt in the spring and fall, a gray seed cap from a company that had been bought and renamed twice since he'd gotten the cap, and boots that had been resoled so many times the uppers and the soles seemed to belong to different decades. Emmett had graduated from high school in 1966, and had come back to the farm the same week because his father had needed him, and because the farm was what he knew, and because if you asked him, which almost nobody did, he would tell you that he'd never wanted to do anything else. He had farmed through the commodity price collapse of the 1980s, through the years when half his neighbors sold out and moved to Cedar Rapids or Des Moines. He had farmed through drought and flood and 3 separate periods when the bank had called him to have conversations that men in his position did not enjoy having. He was still here. The farm was still his. Let me tell you about what Emmett planted with, because it is the center of everything that follows. Emmett Johansson planted his corn with a 1987 white 5,106-row planter. He had bought it used in 1993 for $4,200 from a retiring farmer in Benton County, who had kept it in a shed and maintained it with the kind of care that some people reserve for things they love. The planter was chain drive, not hydraulic motor drive, not electric drive, not variable rate. Chain drive, a mechanical connection between the planter's ground drive wheel and the seed metering units, a connection that was as old as the concept of row crop planting itself, and that operated on a principle so simple a child could understand it. The wheel turns, the chain moves, the plate spins, the seed drops. No controller, no monitor, no software, no cellular connection to a server in Moline, Illinois. Emmett had rebuilt the metering units in 2004. He had replaced the chains in 2011. He had welded a cracked toolbar in 2015 with a rod he'd had in his shop since the 1990s. The planter had no GPS. It had no row shutoffs. It had no variable population capability. What it had was a set of finger pickup meters that Emmett had calibrated by hand every spring for 32 years, dropping seeds into a bucket and counting them until the population was right, adjusting the drive ratio with the sprocket, changed the way his father had taught him and his father's father had taught his father. He had been offered better planters. His son had suggested, twice, that a used John Deere 7000 with vacuum meters would be an upgrade. A salesman from the Marshalltown dealership had stopped by in 2014, and again in 2017, with brochures and financing options and a very compelling presentation about the yield advantages of precision planting. Emmett had listened both times. He had asked questions. He had thanked the salesman for his time. He had not bought anything. He was not against technology. Let me be clear about that because it matters. Emmett used a GPS guidance system on his tractor. Not auto steer, but a light bar that helped him keep his rows straight. He used a yield monitor on his combine. He subscribed to a weather service that texted him forecast updates during planting and harvest. He was not a man who refused progress out of stubbornness or fear. He was a man who had looked at the precision planting systems and made a calculation that the people selling them didn't expect him to make, which was this: a system that can optimize your planting when it works is worth less than a system that always works when you need it to. He had said this to his son, Garrett, one evening in 2017 after the salesman had left. Garrett had pushed back a little, saying that the yield data was real, that the precision systems did produce better stands on variable ground, that the technology had gotten reliable enough to trust. Emmett had nodded and said that might be true. Then he'd asked Garrett what the service technician schedule looked like during the second week of May. Garrett hadn't had an answer for that. Emmett had gone back to reading his seed catalog. Now, let me tell you about Tuesday, April 16th, 2019, because that is the day that the rest of Tama County started paying attention to Emmett Johansson's choices. Emmett had watched the situation develop from his kitchen window and from the conversations at the Agway in Toledo, where farmers gathered in the morning during planting season to drink bad coffee and talk about the weather and equipment. He had heard about the software update on Tuesday afternoon. He had heard about the service backlog on Wednesday morning. He had not said anything in particular about either. He had driven home, checked his soil temperature probes. He had 4 of them, cheap ones he'd bought at a farm auction, placed at different depths in different parts of his fields, looked at his forecast printout, and decided that Thursday morning looked like the right time to start. He was in the field at 5:45 a.m. Thursday, his 1979 John Deere 4440 tractor, a machine he had rebuilt the engine on in 2008, pulled the white planter out of the shed and onto the county road before the sun was fully up. He ran his test pass at the field edge the way he always did, checking seed spacing by stopping the tractor and walking the row, counting seeds in a 10-foot section and calculating population in his head. It was 32,400 seeds per acre. That was what he wanted. That was what he got. By the time Jason Crowley drove past Emmett's farm on his way to check on Curtis Webb's situation at 8:30 that morning, Emmett had already planted 40 acres. Crowley slowed down when he saw the old tractor and the old planter moving steadily across the field. He had seen Emmett's setup before. You couldn't miss it in a county where the average planter had a monitor screen the size of a television and a hydraulic system that could adjust downforce on each individual row. The white 5100 looked, from the road, like something from a different era, which it was. Crowley watched it for a moment, then drove on. He had 14 service calls to manage and a regional VP asking for updates every 2 hours. He didn't have time to think about Emmett Johansson's chain drive planter. Let me tell you about the next 4 days, because they tell you everything you need to know about the difference between a system that can fail and a system that cannot. Emmett planted Thursday. He planted Friday. He planted Saturday. He planted Sunday morning and finished his last field by 2 p.m., at which point he drove the planter back to the shed, cleaned the meters with compressed air, oiled the chains, and covered the machine with a canvas tarp that had covered it every spring since 1993. He had planted 280 acres in 4 days. His soil temperatures had been right. His seed spacing had been right. His depth had been right. He checked it by digging up seeds in 3 locations in each field every day, a habit he'd had since his father had shown him that the only way to know what's happening underground is to put your hand in the ground. The patch from Moline had arrived Thursday morning at 4:47 a.m. Harlan Dykstra had gotten his machine running by 7 a.m. Thursday and had started planting. Curtis Webb had gotten his machine running Friday afternoon. 11 other farmers in the county had lost between 1 and 4 days of optimal planting window. By the time the window closed on Monday, Emmett Johansson was the only farmer with more than 200 acres of corn in Tama County who had planted his entire acreage within his target window without a single hour of equipment downtime. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many of those 11 farmers sitting in their yards on Wednesday afternoon, waiting for a patch from a server in Illinois, would have traded their $300,000 precision planting system for a $4,200 chain drive planter in that moment? Not permanently, not forever, just for that week, in that window, in that field. How many of them would have made that trade? I'll tell you what I think. I think every single one of them would have. Let me tell you about the conversation at the Agway in Toledo on the Monday after planting, because it is a scene that everyone who was there remembers differently depending on who they were in it. There were 7 or 8 farmers at the counter that morning. Harlan was there. Curtis Webb was there. A man named Glenn Borgman, who had lost 3 days on his best river ground, was there. Jason Crowley had stopped in for coffee on his way back from a follow-up visit to a customer's farm. Emmett came in at 7:15, ordered his coffee, and sat at the end of the counter the way he always did. The conversation had been going on for 20 minutes before Emmett arrived. It was the conversation you would expect. The software update, the patch, the lost days, the yield estimates, the question of who was responsible and whether the service contract covered consequential damages, and whether John Deere would offer any kind of compensation. Crowley was handling it the way he had been trained to handle it, which was with genuine sympathy and careful language about what the company could and couldn't commit to. He was good at it. He was also, if you watched his face, a man who had not slept well in 4 days. When Emmett sat down, the conversation shifted the way conversations sometimes shift when someone enters a room who has been right about something. Not dramatically, not immediately, but it shifted. Glenn Borgman was the one who said it first. He said, "Emmett, I drove past your place Thursday morning and you were already running." He said it without accusation, just as a statement of fact that he was still processing. Emmett said he'd had good soil temps and the forecast looked right. Harlan said, "Your planter doesn't have a controller, does it?" Emmett said, "No, it didn't." There was a pause. Crowley was looking at his coffee. Curtis Webb said, "You planted your whole place?" Emmett said he had. Another pause. Glenn Borgman said, "In 4 days." Emmett said, 4 days and a Sunday morning. Crowley looked up then. He was not a man who lacked self-awareness. That was one of the things that made him good at his job. He looked at Emmett for a moment, and then he said, with the careful honesty of a man who knows he is about to say something that costs him something, "How old is that planter?" Emmett said it was a 87. He'd had it since 93. Crowley nodded slowly. He said, "And it worked." Emmett said it had worked every year he'd owned it. Crowley picked up his coffee and looked at it for a moment. Then he said something that Harlan Dykstra would repeat to his son 7 years later in a different context. "I spend a lot of time selling people systems that are smarter than what they replaced. I don't spend enough time asking whether smarter is the same thing as better." He said it quietly, without drama, the way men say things they've been thinking for a while. Nobody responded immediately. The conversation moved on, the way conversations do. But it didn't move on all the way. Something stayed in the room. Let me tell you about what Emmett said when Crowley asked him about it directly, because Crowley did ask 2 days later when he drove out to Emmett's farm on a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing to do with the service call. Crowley had thought about the Agway conversation for 2 days. He had thought about it while he was writing service reports and while he was on the phone with the regional VP and while he was driving between farms. He had not been able to stop thinking about it, which was unusual for him because he was a man who was good at compartmentalizing. He drove out to Emmett's farm without calling ahead, which was also unusual. Emmett was in the machine shed sharpening a cultivator shovel when Crowley pulled in. He didn't seem surprised. He set down the file and wiped his hands on a rag and said he'd been wondering if Crowley would come by. Crowley said he had a question. He said, "You've been offered better planters. I know you have, because my predecessor made the call in 2014, and I made it in 2017. You looked at the numbers. You know what the precision systems can do on variable ground. Why didn't you buy one?" Emmett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the white planter sitting in the shed with its canvas tarp half pulled back. Then he said, "That planter has one moving part that matters: the chain. Everything else is either a bolt or a bearing or a piece of steel. I can fix anything on it with tools I already own in under an hour. It doesn't know what day it is. It doesn't know what software version it's running. It doesn't need to know. It needs to drop a seed every 3 inches at 2 inches of depth, and it does that every time I ask it to, and it will still be doing it the day I'm not here to ask." Crowley said, "But the yield data, the precision systems do produce better stands." Emmett said, "When they work." Crowley said, "They work most of the time." Emmett said, "Most of the time isn't good enough when the window is 5 days." Crowley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So, you gave up yield potential to guarantee you'd never miss a window." Emmett said he didn't think of it as giving up anything. He said, "The best planting system is the one that's running when the ground is ready. My ground was ready Thursday morning. My planter was ready Thursday morning. That's the whole equation." Crowley stood there in the machine shed for a while after that, looking at the old planter. He asked Emmett if he could look at the meters. Emmett pulled the tarp back and showed him the finger pickup units, the chains, the drive sprockets, the simple mechanical connection between wheel and plate. Crowley had a degree in agricultural business and 12 years with one of the most technologically sophisticated equipment companies in the world, and he stood there looking at a 32-year-old planter and understood, maybe for the first time in a way that reached past his training, that there was a category of reliability that his company's engineers had not optimized for because they had not believed it was the variable that mattered most. He asked Emmett what he'd paid for it. Emmett said $4,200 in 1993. Crowley said, "Curtis Webb lost $60,000 in yield this year." Emmett didn't say anything to that. He just pulled the tarp back over the planter. "Let me tell you about the harvest that fall, because the numbers are the final part of the argument that Emmett had been making quietly for 30 years. Emmett's corn averaged 187 bushels per acre across his 280 acres. That was not the highest yield in Tama County. It was not even close to the highest yield in Tama County. Harlan Dykstra, who had gotten his planter running Thursday morning and planted his window as well as he could, averaged 201 bushels per acre on his early planted ground, and 189 on the ground that went in late. Curtis Webb averaged 178 on his full acreage, pulled down by the 400 acres that had missed the window. Glenn Borgman averaged 183. Now let me tell you what those numbers mean in dollars, because the dollars are where the argument becomes undeniable. At $3.65 per bushel corn, Emmett's 280 acres produced 52,360 bushels worth $191,114. His input costs were lower than any of the other farmers I've mentioned. No precision ag subscription, no remote diagnostics, no software update fees built into his service contract. His equipment depreciation was, for practical purposes, 0. The planter had been fully depreciated since before the turn of the century. His tractor was a 444. Oh, he'd rebuilt himself. His total cost of production per bushel was $2.41. His net per bushel was $1.24. His net per acre was $232. Curtis Webb's net per acre, after accounting for the yield loss on his late-planted ground and his precision ag system costs, and his equipment depreciation on a $487,000 planter, was $94. That is not a misprint. $94 per acre net. On 2,400 acres of some of the best ground in Tama County, with the most sophisticated planting technology available in 2019. I am not telling you that Emmett's system was better in every year or in every condition. In a normal year, with no software failures, with the window wide and the service technicians available, the precision systems produce real yield advantages. The variable rate seeding and the hydraulic downforce and the GPS row shutoffs do things that a chain drive planter cannot do, and those things have real value in real dollars. I am not dismissing that. What I am telling you is that in 2019, in Tama County, Iowa, the farmer with the oldest and simplest planting system in the county made more money per acre than almost anyone else. Not because his technology was better, because his technology was there. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 3 years, because the story doesn't end in 2019. Jason Crowley did not leave John Deere after his conversation with Emmett in the machine shed. He stayed, and he did his job, and he was good at it. But something had changed in the way he thought about what he was selling. He started asking his customers different questions. Not just, what yield advantage are you looking for, but what's your downtime tolerance? And what happens to your operation if this machine is offline for 48 hours during your planting window? He started being more honest about the service backlog during peak season. He started recommending, in some cases, that customers with tight windows and limited service access consider whether the precision upgrade was worth the reliability trade-off. His regional manager noticed the change in his sales approach and had a conversation with him about it that was not entirely comfortable. Crowley said what he thought, which was that selling customers technology they couldn't support in the field during their critical windows was not a long-term business strategy. His manager said the data showed that customers with precision systems had higher satisfaction scores and higher renewal rates. Crowley said the data was from years when the systems worked. His manager said that was most years. Crowley said most years wasn't the same as all years, and that the years when it didn't work were the years that defined the relationship. He kept his job. He kept making his numbers. But he started keeping a different kind of record, tracking not just sales and service calls, but the correlation between software update timing and service demand during planting windows. He shared that data with the engineering team in Moline. Whether it changed anything, he couldn't say for certain. But in 2021, John Deere changed its policy on automatic firmware updates for planting equipment, adding a feature that allowed operators to defer updates during defined planting windows. Crowley didn't know if his data had anything to do with that change. He thought it might have. Harlan Dykstra made a decision in the fall of 2019 that surprised people who knew him. He did not trade his 1770 NT for a newer model. He did not add more precision technology. What he did was buy a used John Deere 7000 6-row planter from an estate auction in Benton County for $3,800. He put it in his shed. He told his wife it was a backup. She asked him how often he thought he'd need it. He said he hoped never. She said, then why? He said because the one time he needed it, he'd need it more than he'd ever needed anything. He used it in 2021 when a hydraulic line failure on his 177 ONT sidelined the machine for 19 hours during his second planting day. He hooked the 7000 to his older tractor and planted 180 acres while the service technician worked on the main planter. He lost less than half a day. His neighbor to the south, who had no backup and whose service appointment was 2 days out, lost his window on 300 acres. Let me tell you about the afternoon in October of 2021 when Harlan Dykstra stopped at Emmett Johansson's farm on his way home from the elevator. He had his harvest numbers in his shirt pocket. He'd been thinking about stopping for 2 years. Emmett was in the yard splitting wood when Harlan pulled in. He was 73 years old, and he split wood the way he did everything else, methodically and without hurry, setting each piece on the block and reading the grain before he swung. Harlan got out of his truck and stood there for a moment, watching him. Then he said, "I bought a backup planter." Emmett set them all against the block and looked at him. He said, "What kind?" Harlan said a 7000, 6-row. Used it this spring. Emmett nodded. He said, "How'd it work?" Harlan said it worked fine. He said it worked exactly like it was supposed to. Emmett picked up the maul and set another piece of wood on the block. He said, "They usually do." Harlan stood there for another moment. He said, "I wanted to tell you that I understood what you were doing. In 2019. I didn't at the time, not completely, but I do now." Emmett swung the maul and the wood split clean. He set the two halves aside and looked at Harlan and said, "I wasn't doing anything. I was just planting corn." Harlan said, "That's the point." They stood there in the yard for a while after that, not saying much, the way men who understand each other sometimes don't need to. The light was going gold the way October light does in Iowa, long and low across the harvested fields, and the smell of cut corn and turned earth was still in the air the way it stays for weeks after harvest. Emmett went back to splitting wood. Harlan leaned against his truck and watched him for a while before he drove home. Let me tell you about the last thing that happened, because it is the thing that I think about when I think about Emmett Johansson and his chain drive planter in the spring of 2019. Emmett Johansson died in February of 2023. He was 75 years old. He had farmed his 280 acres right up until the fall of 2022, when his health had made it necessary for Garrett to take over the field work. He died on a Tuesday morning, which is the same day of the week that Harlan Dykstra had stood in his field watching his monitor blink in 2019. And I don't know if that means anything, but I notice it. Garrett Johansson took over the farm. He was 44 years old, a careful farmer, methodical the way his father had been methodical. He had a different relationship with technology than his father. He used precision ag on his combine. He ran auto steer on the tractor. He subscribed to a variable rate fertility service that had improved his input efficiency meaningfully. He was not his father in that way, but the White 5100 planter was still in the shed. Garrett had not sold it. He had not traded it. He had serviced it in the fall of 2022 the way his father had always serviced it, replacing the chains, checking the meters, covering it with the canvas tarp. When people asked him why he kept it, he said something that sounded like his father, which was that he hoped he'd never need it, and that was exactly why he was keeping it. In April of 2024, there was a different kind of problem, not a software update this time. A supply chain disruption that had affected hydraulic components for several major planter brands, leaving service technicians unable to complete repairs because the parts weren't available. The backlog was worse than 2019 in some ways because it wasn't a software problem you could patch remotely. It was a physical part that had to be ordered and shipped and installed. The wait was 10 days in some cases. Garrett Johansson planted his 280 acres with the white 5100 that spring. He used his father's calibration method, seeds in a bucket, counting by hand, sprocket change for the drive ratio. He was in the field on the first day of his optimal window, and he finished on the fourth day. He did not lose an hour to equipment failure. His neighbor to the north, a 28-year-old farmer named Isaac Rasmussen, who had taken over his family's operation 2 years earlier and invested heavily in the latest generation planting technology, lost 11 days to the parts backlog. He was a smart farmer and a hard worker, and the technology he'd bought was genuinely good technology. It just wasn't running when his window was open. Isaac drove past Garrett's field on the third day of his own forced downtime and watched the old white planter moving steadily across the field behind the 4440 tractor. The same tractor Emmett had rebuilt in 2008. Still running, still pulling. He pulled over on the county road and watched for a while. Then he drove to the Agway in Toledo and had a cup of coffee and thought about what he'd seen. He went back to Garrett's farm that evening. Garrett was in the shed doing his end-of-day check on the planter when Isaac knocked on the doorframe. Isaac said he'd watched him planting that afternoon. He said his own machine was down, and he was looking at 10 more days before the part arrived. He said, "Is there any chance?" And Garrett said yes before he finished the sentence. He said, "I'll be done with my ground tomorrow afternoon. You can have it Friday." Isaac Rasmussen planted 180 acres with Emmett Johansson's white 5100 planter in April of 2024. The planter was 37 years old. It worked perfectly. When he brought it back, Isaac asked Garrett what his father had paid for it. Garrett said $4,200 in 1993. Isaac stood there doing the arithmetic in his head. 31 years of service, 31 springs, the 2019 crisis, the 2024 crisis, the unbroken string of planting windows met and fields in the ground and crops in the bin. He said, "What do you think it's worth now?" Garrett said he didn't think about it that way. He said, "It's not worth anything. It's not for sale." Isaac nodded. He understood that. Let me tell you one last thing, because I think it is the thing that Emmett Johansson understood that is hardest to explain to people who have not farmed, which is this: the planting window does not negotiate. It does not wait for a patch or a service technician or a parts shipment. It opens when the soil temperature is right and the forecast is favorable, and the ground will take a seed at the right depth with the right moisture around it, and it closes when those conditions change, and it does not care what you paid for your planter or how many features it has or what the yield data says about its performance in optimal conditions. The window is the window. The machine either runs or it doesn't. The seed either goes in the ground or it doesn't. Emmett Johansson had understood this in a way that was not fashionable and not profitable for anyone trying to sell him something. But that was correct in the way that simple things are sometimes correct, not because they are sophisticated, but because they are true. He had built his operation around the irreducible fact that a planter that runs is worth more than a planter that can't. Not in every year, not in every condition, but in the years and conditions that matter most, in the narrow windows when the difference between planting and not planting is the difference between a good year and a year you're still paying for at Christmas. The machine that has no software to update and no hydraulic controller to fault and no cellular connection to a server that might push the wrong code at the wrong time. That machine is worth more than any number printed on a sales brochure. The White 5100 is still in the shed on the Johansson farm in Tama County, Iowa. Garrett services it every fall. The chains are on their third replacement. The meters have been rebuilt twice. The toolbar has been welded in 2 places. The canvas tarp is the same one Emmett bought in 1993, patched in 4 spots, still doing its job. Experts will tell you that a 37-year-old chain drive planter with no precision technology is an artifact, a curiosity, something you'd see at a farm show in the antique equipment row. The Johanssons will tell you it's a planter. They'll tell you it plants corn. They'll tell you it has never, in 31 years, failed to be running when the window opened. And that is the whole story. Except that it isn't, because stories like this one don't end. They just keep planting.